The #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 chart had become untouchable. For 14 consecutive weeks in early 1964, the Beatles held that position with I Want to Hold Your Hand, a grip so tight that the entire music industry had accepted it as permanent. Radio stations played Beatles songs on endless rotation. Teenage girls screamed themselves hoarse at airports and concert halls. Ed Sullivan's show had drawn 73 million viewers to watch four young men from Liverpool change American culture forever. The message from the industry was clear and unanimous. The old guard was finished. Jazz was dead. Traditional pop was obsolete. Anyone over 30 might as well retire because the future belonged to rock and roll belonged to the young. And then on May 9, 1964, a 64-year-old man with a gravelly voice and a trumpet did something nobody thought was possible anymore. Louis Armstrong knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts, and what happened next revealed something more important than the chart position itself. It revealed what real greatness looks like when it doesn't need to diminish others to prove its worth. The Beatles' phenomenon in 1964 wasn't just about music. It was a cultural earthquake that seemed to invalidate everything that had come before. When they landed at Kennedy Airport in February, when they performed on Ed Sullivan, when their songs dominated not just the #1 spot but multiple positions in the top 5 simultaneously, they weren't just successful. They were a declaration that the world had changed, that the old rules no longer applied, that youth and energy and a new sound had rendered everything previous irrelevant. For musicians like Louis Armstrong, who had spent decades building jazz into an art form, who had survived racism and poverty and constant reinvention, the Beatles represented an existential challenge. Not because they were talented, Louis could recognize talent, but because the narrative around them suggested that talent from previous generations no longer mattered. Louis Armstrong was 64 years old in 1964, and the music industry treated him like a relic. Radio stations that had played his music for decades now considered him too old-fashioned for their playlists. Booking agents who had once competed for his performances now suggested he consider retirement. Young musicians, caught up in the excitement of the British invasion, spoke about Louis with respect for his historical contributions, but made it clear they saw him as past tense, someone to be honored for what he'd been, not consulted for what he might still become. The message, delivered with varying degrees of politeness, was consistent. Your time is over, step aside, let the young people have their moment. But Louis had been hearing versions of that message his entire career. When he'd innovated in the 1920s, traditionalists said he was ruining jazz. When he'd embraced swing in the 1930s, the bebop revolutionaries said he was old-fashioned. When he performed popular standards in the 1940s and 50s, the cool jazz advocates said he was selling out. Every generation of critics had a reason why Louis Armstrong was finished, irrelevant, too old or too commercial or too something to matter anymore. And every time, Louis had proven them wrong, not by fighting them, not by arguing about his importance, but by continuing to make music that moved people, that crossed boundaries, that reminded everyone that quality doesn't have an expiration date. In late 1963, Louis received an offer to record the title song from a new Broadway musical called Hello, Dolly. The show was a big, old-fashioned musical comedy starring Carol Channing, the kind of production that seemed completely out of step with the times. Rock and roll had made Broadway seem quaint, a holdover from an era when families went to theaters instead of teenagers buying records. But Louis heard something in the song that interested him. It was simple, joyful, unpretentious, a celebration of connection and greeting and the basic human pleasure of seeing someone you're happy to see. There was no deep message, no cultural commentary. Just hello, Dolly, it's so nice to have you back where you belong. Pure and straightforward. The recording session happened in December 1963, before the Beatles had even arrived in America, before anyone knew that 1964 would become the year of Beatlemania. Louis sang Hello, Dolly, with his characteristic warmth, his voice raspy and rich, backed by a small jazz ensemble. The arrangement was traditional, the whole production unabashedly old-fashioned. There was no attempt to sound contemporary, no concession to rock and roll, no effort to compete with whatever the young people were listening to. It was Louis Armstrong being Louis Armstrong, which meant it was jazz, it was joy, and it was completely unapologetically itself. When the song was released as a single in February 1964, nobody expected much. The Beatles had just landed in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand was climbing the charts with unstoppable momentum. Radio was consumed with British invasion. Music, a 64-year-old jazz musician singing a show tune from a Broadway musical, seemed almost willfully irrelevant. Music industry executives at Cap Records, Louis' label, treated Hello, Dolly as a prestige project, something that might sell modestly to Louis' aging fan base but wouldn't compete in the contemporary market. They were preparing for the Beatles' dominance, not challenging it, but something unexpected started happening. Hello, Dolly began getting radio play, not just on traditional pop stations that still played older artists, but on top 40 radio, mixed in with all the rock and roll. People called in requesting it. DJ noticed that when they played it, listener response was enthusiastic. The song started climbing the charts, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. By April, it was in the top 20. By late April, it was in the top 10. And the Beatles, who had been dominating the #1 position for months, suddenly had unexpected competition from the most unlikely source imaginable. The media narrative around this chart battle was predictable. Old versus new, jazz versus rock, the past fighting to stay relevant against the inevitable future. Reporters asked Louis about competing with the Beatles, about trying to reclaim the charts from the young British invaders, about whether this was his last stand before retirement. They wanted a story about generational warfare, about an aging musician desperate to prove he still mattered. And Louis, who had lived through enough real battles to recognize manufactured ones, refused to play along. "The Beatles are great," Louis said in interview after interview. "I love what they're doing. They're talented, they're creative, and people love them. That's beautiful. I'm not competing with them. I'm just making music the way I always have." When reporters pressed him, suggesting there must be some rivalry, some resentment that these young kids from England were dominating American charts, Louis would smile and shake his head. "Music isn't about who's on top, it's about making people happy. If the Beatles make people happy, that's wonderful. If I make people happy, that's wonderful too. There's room for both." On May 9, 1964, Hello, Dolly reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, ending the Beatles' 14-week reign at the top. Louis Armstrong, at 64 years old, became the oldest artist ever to have a #1 hit, a record that would stand for decades. The achievement was unprecedented, impossible, a violation of every rule the music industry thought it understood about age and relevance and what audiences wanted. And the person who accomplished it responded with characteristic grace and generosity. When reporters called Louis to get his reaction, expecting triumph or vindication, he said simply, "It's nice. I'm grateful people are listening to the song, but the Beatles are still great. This doesn't change that." He didn't gloat. He didn't claim victory in some generational war. He didn't use his moment on top to diminish the artists he'd displaced. Instead, he did something radical. He insisted that quality could coexist, that there was no natural law requiring young artists and older artists to be in competition, that the manufactured conflict between generations was exactly that, manufactured. The Beatles themselves responded with equal class. When asked about being knocked off the #1 spot, Paul McCartney said, "Louis Armstrong is a legend. If we had to lose the top spot to someone, I'm glad it was him." John Lennon added, "He's been making great music since before we were born. There's no shame in being second to Louis Armstrong." The mutual respect between the supposed rivals revealed something important. The conflict, the generational warfare, the narrative that one generation had to defeat another, existed primarily in the minds of media and industry executives looking for a dramatic story. The artists themselves understood something the narrative missed, that excellence transcends age, that quality doesn't compete with quality, that there's enough room in the world for different kinds of greatness. Hello, Dolly stayed at #1 for only 1 week before the Beatles returned with Love Me Do. Louis Armstrong would never have another #1 hit. The British invasion would continue to dominate the charts, and rock and roll would indeed become the defining sound of the 1960s. In the long view of music history, Louis's week at #1 was a brief interruption in the Beatles' transformation of popular culture. But the significance of that week wasn't about longevity or dominance. It was about what it proved. That age doesn't disqualify greatness. That traditional forms still have power when executed with excellence. That audiences are more sophisticated than industry executives give them credit for, capable of appreciating both the revolutionary and the traditional. What Louis Armstrong demonstrated in May 1964 was something the music industry desperately needed to learn: that the new doesn't have to destroy the old, that innovation doesn't require demolishing everything that came before, that young artists and established artists aren't natural enemies but part of a continuum, each building on what previous generations created while adding their own voice. The Beatles were revolutionary, but they were revolutionary in a context that Louis Armstrong and countless other jazz musicians had helped create. The idea that individual artists could be creative, that popular music could be art, that performers could write their own material and express their own vision, all of that had been pioneered by jazz musicians in the decades before rock and roll existed. Louis understood this continuity in ways that many of his critics didn't. He saw the Beatles not as destroyers of his legacy, but as inheritors of principles he'd helped establish: the freedom to experiment, the courage to be different, the belief that popular entertainment could also be artistically serious. These were values that connected Louis' innovations in the 1920s to the Beatles' innovations in the 1960s. The generational conflict was a myth. The reality was dialogue, evolution, different artists in different eras wrestling with similar questions about how to make music that mattered. The weak Hello, Dolly, Spin at #1 became a teaching moment that many people missed at the time, but that looks increasingly important in retrospect. Louis Armstrong proved that you don't have to diminish others to celebrate your own success, that graciousness and generosity aren't weakness but strength, that the measure of an artist isn't just what they create but how they treat other creators, when given the opportunity to claim victory in a manufactured war. Louis instead insisted on peace. When offered the chance to put down the young artists who represented the future, he praised them instead. This attitude, this refusal to participate in generational combat, came from Louis' understanding that his worth as an artist didn't depend on anyone else's failure. The Beatles being great didn't make him less great. His success didn't diminish theirs. There was room in the world for multiple kinds of excellence, and insisting otherwise benefited nobody except people trying to sell a conflict narrative. Louis's confidence was deep enough that he didn't need to tear down others to build himself up. He knew what he'd contributed to music, knew what he could still contribute, and that knowledge made him immune to the insecurity that drives competition. In the years that followed, Louis Armstrong and the Beatles would occasionally cross paths. They spoke with mutual respect and admiration. The Beatles would credit jazz musicians, including Louis, as influences on their music. Louis would speak about the Beatles as talented artists doing important work. There was no drama, no rivalry, no resentment, just 2 points on a musical continuum, different in approach but connected in their commitment to excellence and innovation. Today, both Louis Armstrong and the Beatles are recognized as giants of 20th century music. Louis's innovations in jazz in the 1920s and 30s are taught in music schools worldwide. The Beatles' transformation of rock and roll in the 1960s is equally foundational. They exist not in competition but in conversation, each having contributed something irreplaceable to the evolution of popular music. And the week in May 1964 when their chart positions briefly intersected stands as a reminder that greatness doesn't have an age limit, that quality can emerge from any generation, and that the best response to excellence isn't competition but celebration. The lesson Louis Armstrong taught in 1964 remains relevant in 2026 and will remain relevant long after. In a culture obsessed with youth, with the next big thing, with declaring things obsolete and outdated, Louis proved that quality endures. That experience has value, that an artist who has been excellent for 40 years might still have something to offer that a new artist, however talented, cannot provide. Not because the new artist isn't great, but because different kinds of greatness serve different purposes, answer different needs, offer different gifts. At 64, when the world was telling him to step aside, Louis Armstrong stepped forward. He made a record that was unabashedly traditional, that made no concessions to contemporary trends. That was exactly what he wanted it to be. And for 1 week, that record stood at the top of the charts, proof that authenticity doesn't age, that excellence doesn't expire, that the crowd isn't always right when they declare something over. And then, having proven his point, Louis did something even more impressive. He gave credit to the artists who came after him. He insisted that their success was legitimate, that the future belonged to them, that his moment on top was just a moment and that was fine. That's what beating the Beatles looked like for Louis Armstrong. Not gloating or claiming superiority, not diminishing or competing, just being excellent, being gracious, and being secure enough in his own worth that he could celebrate excellence wherever he found it. At 64 years old, he taught the music industry, taught the culture, taught everyone watching that the real victory isn't about who's number one. It's about how you carry yourself when you get there and how you treat the people you supposedly defeated. That's a lesson the Beatles themselves seem to understand, responding to their displacement not with resentment but with respect. And together, the aging jazz legend and the young rock revolutionaries showed the world what it looks like when greatness recognizes greatness, when competition gives way to mutual admiration, when the manufactured conflicts dissolve in the face of genuine excellence. 64 years old, number one on the charts, 1 week at the top, and a masterclass in dignity that would outlast any chart position. That's the story of how Louis Armstrong beat the Beatles, not by defeating them, but by proving that in music, in art, in life, there's room for multiple winners, that the charts might only have one number one spot, but the world has space for infinite greatness, and that the measure of an artist isn't just whether they can reach the top, but whether they can do it without losing themselves, without betraying their values, without becoming the kind of person who needs others to lose for them to win. Hello, Dolly. Nice to have you back where you belong, at the top of the charts, at 64, teaching everyone what it really means to be number one.